Welcome to Calcast, your Create International podcast. God Network News, where we give you a new perspective
on events happening in our world today.
This is GNN.
This is God Network News, episode 201. Welcome, GNN fans, to another episode of God Network News, the podcast that tells you what God's doing around the world. Not what CNN tells you, but what GNN tells you is going on in the world. If you're tired of listening to all of that crisis network news and you want to hear what God's doing, well, give us a listen. Steve Addison is a great podcaster and very passionate about movements of peoples to Christ. And Steve has his own podcast, very successful podcast, with over 226 podcast episodes. And the name of his podcast is On the Road to No Place Left. And we highly recommend that you subscribe to his podcast because he has an overwhelming library of exciting topics related to movements. And if you want to learn more about movements, this is the place to find the information, and he has lots of training and tools and other resources that will really make your investigation of this topic successful. So we really want to thank Steve Addison and his partners there at movements.net/podcast. That's how you can find it, at movements.net/podcast, for all of the resources that he has given us for these next few podcasts. Thank you very much, Steve.
I was in theological seminary in Germany and had just started. And we had one series of lectures, Introduction to Missiology, just 15 lectures. And one of them, my missions professor, a Canadian Mennonite, Hans Karsdorf, devoted to the topics of people movements. It blew my mind. Wow. It caught my attention. So after 45 minutes of lecture, I was shaking my head and thinking, wow, why am I only now hearing about movements? Why is not every missionary who comes to our chapel talking about movements? Why is not every missionary who came to my home church talking about movements? Why? This is amazing. This is fascinating. So, 45 minutes, and he talked a bit about Westcomb Pickett and Christian mass movements in India, and Alan Tippett and people movements, as it was called at the time, in southern Polynesia, and a little bit about McGavran and the Bridges of God. But boy, he had me fascinated. Fascinated to the degree that I told you I was a young radical, a newbie but radical. I decided I want to learn anything I can about movements. So I drove to the university library. There's a library in Germany that has the mandate to buy any theological, messiological book that is published anywhere in the world, right? Most countries have that. So I knew that my library would have any book that has ever been published on movements. And I went into the library and photocopied page by page of all the books. There were only a handful, but, half a dozen. Photocopied every single book page that I could find at that time to do with movements, and studied. And I was by myself. I didn't find any fellow student who was equally interested in the topic. And that's what prepared me for ministry among Muslims in the Sudan. So, with a highlighter and a pencil, writing observations, and then I started a Word file. I'm always someone who thinks application, thinks implementation. Well, what's the practical takeaway from from this great theory. And I've started a Word file on my first computer to say, what does it mean in terms of implementation? What are practical steps that I can glean from this for ministry? So, for example, I'd never heard of the concept of multi-individual conversion. To think instead of extracting, and that was the model of the time, pretty much, especially among those ministering among Muslim, extracting Muhammad, extracting Muna, and then trying to build a little house church around them, while they're most likely alienated from their family, to think, how can I understand, read, authority structures in society, connections, relationships, and rather steer a whole group, like a household, what the Book of Acts calls an oikos, an extended family, into the kingdom. How can I focus on leaders? In Sudan, typically in rural societies, the so-called sheikhs, the traditional village chiefs. How can I make sure, they are part of a process? So I developed a vision to really bring a whole people group into the kingdom, which God confirmed. God gave me a vivid dream as I prayed over a particular people group in Sudan, and showed me that, yes, there would be a big move of God among that people group one day. And that was at a time when there were maybe 2 or 3 non-believers. So it was absolutely unengaged at the time, and just less than a handful of believers there. But when I hit the ground in Sudan, it was with the prayer, and my team and I were praying for nothing less than a movement. So when we did pray together several times a week, we did pray for a neighbor, Faisal, and, for a neighbor, Asha, but we also prayed for the village chiefs. We also prayed for a movement and reached out to people, always not only seeing the individual, but seeing the network behind them, and thinking, how could we place, the good news most effectively in this community?
And so how did you go sort of taking what you've learnt from practitioners about movements, but then applying it in Sudan?
Right. Trying out a lot of things. So we experimented, with identity. How do we present ourselves? Well, initially, you learn Arabic, and then we're Christian. Okay, every Muslim nods and drawer closed. You're in the box, and the conversation is over, because now they know what you believe and what you stand for, and it's not worthwhile entertaining in any spiritual conversation, right? Because a Muslim is superior in his understanding of God and the truth than from a Christian.
You're listening to God Network News Podcast with your host, Cal Curtis. Look up our website at godnetworknews.com.
So then we experimented. Well, what does that mean if we say, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, of Isa, or I have surrendered my life to God in Isa. So we always wanted to bring Jesus into the conversation. So experimenting with who are we? How do we present ourselves? And experimenting then, what is good news for Muslims? So as we were diving deeper into the culture, we got to know the brokenness and their pain and their hungers. And then thought, how can we formulate a gospel message that is truly good news to them? That is the good news of the kingdom. Jesus says, he was preaching the good news of the kingdom. So in other words, to me, in essence, whatever we formulate as good news has to be the kingdom of God. But what is the expression of the kingdom of God for these people, meeting their needs, meeting them where they are in life at the time that we have the conversation with them? So that was a whole process of experimenting, always thinking again, how can we develop a message that is good news for this entire people group? And who do we need to relate to, reach out to, love on, and then share with, so that there is a gradual opening for the good news, not only among a handful of individuals, but at a communal level.
And did you see those breakthroughs happen?
We did not see it at the desired scale in the big city. Now that is interesting, and have long thought and analyzed what might have led to this. So we did see fruit. My neighbor from across the road, let's call him Frank, he came into the kingdom. Even though my Arabic was still broken, we used some English as well, but, so at an early stage, I had arrived in the neighborhood 8 months before, and he committed to Christ. And we saw a house church established. Now, the model didn't work fully, and I guess one of the reasons was that we're still learning and experimenting ourselves. And we only saw men come into the kingdom. So again, it was individual conversion, individual decision. And because it was only men, it didn't include the wives, it didn't include the children. And also it was mostly younger men who were not opinion leaders in society, who were not, authority figures whose word had weight. So we saw some fruit in the city, but not a movement. Then we deliberately moved into a rural area. I had read at the time that most people movements start in rural areas, in village contexts, where society is still more closely knit. And that's what we did. And reached out to the village chiefs. So it was a humanitarian context. We had to an identity as NGO workers, and started an NGO with a supplementary feeding program for malnourished children, a primary health care, a clinic in a tent, this type of thing, to express, the compassion of Christ. But we wanted, again, an identity question. We had learned that now. From day one, we wanted to make sure they perceive us as spiritual people, as people who are different from the other white faces they had known. So had a meeting to get to know the village chiefs of the wider area. Picture me under a tree with 50 chiefs, and basically said, we are here to serve you and your people, your society. We also want you to know we're people who serve God with our lives and with this with these services here. So a spiritual identity established from the very first encounter, I believe, was key. And then bring Jesus into every conversation. That was our approach in a, again, contextual, sensitive way, not in an obnoxious way, but, bring him into every conversation. Well, why are you here? Well, why is a white man in a underdeveloped, civil war-torn rural area? Well, the answer, I could have told them anything, but has to do with Jesus, and was basically, in essence, I'm one of the followers of Jesus. And Jesus really exhorts his followers to express compassion to the needy. And I heard about your need here, and so that's the reason we're here. Any question? So, do you think there is hope that we would have peace here again? Well, again, that requires a longer answer. Why don't we have peace? But in essence, Jesus is in Islam the Nabi as-Salam, the Prince of Peace. You can only have peace with each other between tribes and in your families, from village to village, if you first have peace with God in your heart. And peace with God you can have, if you put your trust in Jesus. So bring Jesus into every conversation, basically. And then realize they were generally open. First, it was probably the respect for the outsider, the foreigner, the NGO director. But then I realized they started to think for the first time, probably in their life, seriously about, and a paradigm, an alternative paradigm than the one that people group had believed in for 500 years. 100% of them, they had never even considered an alternative.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider donating to help us continue to bring exciting stories fresh from the field. Visit our website at godnetworknews.com and select the PayPal link on the right side of the page, or consider becoming a Patreon partner to receive access to more valuable materials exclusive to our members.